Right, good morning. Welcome again to this meeting of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. And I remind all members and witnesses and those in the gallery to turn off their mobile phones and other electrical devices. We're on item 2 on the agenda. I would ask the committee to agree to take item 6 in private. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Okay, item 3 on the agenda, we're continuing our draft budget scrutiny for 2013-14. Can I welcome back to the committee our budget advisor, Joe Armstrong, and welcome our first panel of witnesses, David Lonsdale, Assistant Director of CBI Scotland, Stephen Boyd, who's Assistant Secretary of the STUC, Colin Borland, Head of External Affairs at Federation of Small Business, and John Downie, Director of Public Affairs at SCVO. Welcome to you all, gentlemen, and thank you for coming along this morning. Before we get into questions, if you would like to have the opportunity just in a few moments to say something by way of introduction, the committee would be happy to hear from you. Mr. Lonsdale, do you want to start?
Well, thank you, Convener, for the kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation here today. Obviously, we consulted with our members following the publication of the budget, and we put in a written submission both to this committee and to the Infrastructure Committee of the Parliament as well. And I guess the sort of headline message is that we recognise this is the second year of a 3-year spending review, and therefore it's maybe not necessarily as fascinating a budget as last year's one or pre-election one perhaps, but obviously there are a number of positives in the budget. We think there are 1 or 2 missed opportunities, and obviously 1 or 2 things we're less keen on. For example, the increase in empty property rates is coming into effect next spring, but happy to expand on any of that during the discussion.
Thank you. Stephen Boyd.
Good morning and thanks for the invitation. Interested to be sitting in the centre right of this august panel, which is a kind of unusual position for me. I don't think I've got much to add to the written statement by way of opening comments. I think I've maybe just stressed the point that in presenting the presentation of the budget and many of the initial responses to it centred round about the role of this budget in bringing Scotland out of its current prolonged economic slump. I think from the STUC's perspective, we'd want to emphasise that we believe everyone should be realistic about what the Scottish Government can achieve in that respect at this moment in time.
Okay, thank you. Colin Borland.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Convener and everyone. I think as we outlined in our written submission, from our point of view, perhaps more relevant than the raw headline numbers about how much has been spent in a particular department, we believe that the success or failure will depend very much on how that is spent, whether that's in the measures which are outlined round about encouraging small businesses to create more jobs for young people, whether it's around the initiative to bring more empty properties back into some form of commercial use, or indeed some of the questions that have been outlined around about capital spend.
Okay, thank you. John Downie.
Thanks very much for Convener for the invitation. I suppose from our point of view as well, I would echo Colin's point, it's actually about what we spend the budget on, what we want to try and achieve in terms of Scotland. I was in front of the Health Committee yesterday, and one of the points I made was we're spending £11 billion on health, and yet we still, after 13 years of devolution, have the worst health outcomes in Europe. So actually, it's not about the spend, it's actually what we're spending it on. And I think that, in terms of economic growth and the economic model that we currently have, which could be argued has actually failed us. We're in a situation where we don't have an economic model that looks at social and environmental outcomes as much as they do sustainable economic growth outcomes. So I think what we do need is a rethink on the economy, and actually the budget plays a key part on that, and decide what we want to achieve into building up local economies, resilient communities, to actually better deal with what we've been facing and actually probably what we're going to face in relation to welfare reform.
Okay, thank you all very much. I'm sure we'll be pursuing a number of these issues in more detail in questions. Just before I ask Rhoda Grant to ask the first question, given we've got a reasonably large panel this morning, and given many of you, I'm sure from past experience, will want to have your say, it would be helpful if we could keep questions short and to the point, and keep answers as short as possible. And please don't all feel you have to answer every question. And if questioners are able to direct their questions to particular members of the panel, that would be helpful in terms of trying to get through the number of issues I think we want to tackle in the time available. And with that admonition, I'll invite Rhoda Grant if she would ask the first question.
Thank you, Convener. Is this a budget for jobs and growth, and what more could be done within the Scottish budget to grow the economy and create jobs?
Who'd like to start with that? Stephen, Boyd?
I mean, as I said in my opening comments, I think we have to be very realistic about what the Scottish budget can achieve at this moment in time. We've seen over the last 4 years unemployment double. We've seen underemployment rise to a level where over 240,000 people in Scotland currently identify themselves as underemployed, i.e. they can't get enough hours in their current job to make ends meet. I was reading in the chain on the way through a recent paper from Capital Economics, UK level, talking about the size of the output gap, which they estimate to be around about 13%. I mean, we're not at UK or Scottish level close to achieving pre-recession levels of output. And if you look at levels of output in manufacturing, if you look at exports, etc., again, nowhere near close to attaining pre-recession levels. So I think in that context, you have to be realistic about what the Scottish budget can achieve here. Now, there is always a debate to be had about whether or not certain measures are appropriate or not, and certainly appeared before the committee. Last year, we had a long discussion about the small business bonus scheme, and we've highlighted that again in our submission. We think that money could be far more effectively used to promote growth in jobs, but we have to recognise that that's a spend of 150 million, which is not insubstantial, but in terms of bringing Scotland out of the current prolonged economic slump, it's not sufficient, you know. So again, I think we just have to really be very clear about what's possible here.
Sir. Thank you. Yeah, I think everything about the economy and economic growth, in our experience, seems to come back to the question about jobs and employment. It's the unemployment and the fear thereof that is, that has harmed consumer confidence in previous years, and what we're now seeing is that's having an impact on business confidence to the extent where investment plans are being shelved. So the provisions within the budget to look at how we can help small businesses, support them to create more jobs, absolutely have to be welcomed. Some recent figures in a report which we published showed that 9 out of every 10 unemployed people who leave unemployment to take a private sector employment do so either by becoming self-employed or by getting a job in a small or medium-sized enterprise. So that shows you that it's small businesses that shorten the dole queues, and our focus absolutely has to be on them and listening to them and the sort of barriers that they face in helping recruit. There is some interesting work that we've been doing on this. It's not quite ready to be published, and I don't want to preempt the findings of that report, but some of the findings in that are quite interesting and challenge some of the preconceptions about what these traditional barriers might be. So we have to, focus on that and design any scheme, if we have extra money coming forward, to support that, to support that level of job creation, that it is absolutely tailored to those small businesses. If I could turn just to the vexed issue of the small business bonus, which seems to come up with a monotonous regularity when we talk to the STUC about this. First of all...
Don't talk to the STUC about this.
Yeah. First of all, when...
Briefly, perhaps.
Yes, yes. It's an interesting definition of a cost or a spend to allow people to hang on to a little bit more of their own money. When you look at your pay packet and you see tax at 20 or 40%, you don't think, there's that nice Mr. Osborne giving me 80 or 60% giveaway. What this essentially is, it's a tax threshold, and we either believe in progressive taxation or we don't. What we know is that it has helped 1 in 8 businesses remain in existence throughout the difficult economic period. We know that if you think there's, 80-odd thousand recipients of the small business bonus, 1 in 8 of them, we're talking 10,000 businesses. That's a lot. If they employ one and a part-time member of staff, that's an awful lot of jobs that have been safeguarded in the Scottish economy. And if we're looking at where jobs and employment are going to come from, then why on earth would you impose some sort of super tax on the very businesses which are going to create that?
Lonsdale?
Stephen makes a good point. There's a wider panoply of public policy interventions, if you like, that will affect the growth rate of the economy and the success or otherwise of businesses and generating growth. And it's not just about the budget, but obviously in our submission we've outlined a number of ways we think the budget can help, particularly over the longer term, because I think expecting great things in the immediate course from a budget is just unrealistic. So we've talked in our budget submission about setting a course of direction in terms of infrastructure spending as a proportion of the overall spend of the budget, the devolved budget, as well as on skills and export support. We've obviously highlighted a number of other areas we think could be improved as well in order to free up money to spend more on infrastructure, more on skills, but also try and avoid some of the tax increases we have seen in recent times. And I agree with Colin's point about keeping taxes down, and that's one of the reasons why we were against the retail levy that came into effect earlier this year, and we don't support the the empty premises tax hike that's coming into effect next year.
I suppose to answer Rhoda's question, I mean, in terms of the headline figures from the budget, 9 million in enterprise and 263 million on health, it doesn't particularly look like a budget for growth and enterprise. And I think I would agree in general with what people, Colin and David, are saying. It's actually about how do we create more jobs within the economy. And I think that's a key. All our members we talk to, whether they're social enterprise, large charities, voluntary organisations, say it's about people. In some senses, investment in the sector is about their growth is dependent on getting the right people. And through Community Jobs Scotland, last year we created over 1,800 jobs with a consortium of 500 third sector organisations. This year we're doing 1,000. Frankly, we think we could, the third sector could create, more jobs probably over the next 4 years, around 16,000 if we had the investment. Because I think in terms of the private sector, we are going to have a jobless recovery. So we need to think about, one, what the third sector can do in growing jobs in the economy there, and actually in terms of small businesses, grow what we can do in local economies to retain finance there. And that brings in the bigger question about government spending, in terms of 9 billion a year on procurement. And we have a procurement bill, which frankly at the moment is all process and not about actually spending to deliver better social, environmental and local economic outcomes. So I think we have to think about, if we're going to grow the economy, what can we focus the money government spending on? And I think, so there's a whole range of issues within that. And I think, but it is about, all the people are saying, it's about people, and we can create jobs if given the opportunity.
Yep. Our last panel gave us some evidence that was quite interesting, and I wondered what your observations on it were. As you know, the government are moving a revenue spend into capital spend, and the evidence that was suggested that might be counterproductive for jobs, that moving money from revenue cuts public sector jobs and doesn't create the equivalent amount in the private sector, given the amounts of money we're talking about. Does that resonate, or do we still need more capital funding? Have we enough capital funding? Should we be doing more about infrastructure and issues such as broadband and transport and the like?
Certainly our evidence to the committee, but also in our submissions and meetings with the Finance Secretary ahead of the spending review, we were articulating the point that we supported the switch from revenue to capital. We think there should be a step change in the proportion of the devolved budget that's spent on infrastructure and skills and so on. And that does make for difficult political choices for politicians and for administrations of the day, but we think that's a better course. It's also much more, I think, beneficial in terms of the long term for the economy, improving our economic potential, moving forward to invest in broadband and transport infrastructure, other forms of communications infrastructure as well. So we think that's a positive thing that they're doing.
That create the equivalent number of jobs? I think the argument was that as employment rises, then economic growth is stalled, and if you're actually putting more people out of work, you have, it's almost a self-perpetuating situation.
Well, there's a balance to be struck between revenue and capital and what social and other programmes the administration of the day want to spend money on. But in terms of improving the long-term economic potential of the economy. We think investment in infrastructure is actually a very good way of going about that. The CBI has produced other research showing the economic multipliers and effects of that are very high in terms of getting sort of bang for your buck, if you like, and I'm very happy to provide that to the committee afterwards. So that's our position.
I hope they can return later on to some of the points Colin made about the small business bonus scheme, but in direct response to your question, the STUC broadly supported last year the shift from revenue to capital, understanding, again, I'm really just following on from the points David's already made, understanding where the economy was and if it could boost capital spending at that time, it was likely to be over the longer term beneficial. We're much less supportive this year. I don't think anyone has the information necessary to make a proper judgment about whether the net jobs impact of the moves over the last couple of years have been beneficial to the Scottish economy. I mean, one of the issues that's really discussed, I think, in public policy discourse in Scotland is that as a small, open economy, we are prone to leakage from the economy through infrastructure investment. I mean, is this investment going to Scottish firms investing in Scotland? I mean, we don't know, I would say so. And we also are unable, I was trying over the last month to make a comparison of public sector job losses through the course of the recession in Scotland and other parts of the UK. Again, that simple bit of information, you can't get directly comparable figures for Scotland and the regions and nations of the UK, which is a major concern. So we don't know if Scotland has lost more public sector jobs in other areas of the UK. So, simply I don't think we're able to answer that. But I think, overall, if we are shifting from revenue to capital, if it is introducing extra pressure on public sector budgets and it is putting extra pressure on employment, I mean, all we're doing at the end of the day really shifting demand about the economy at a time when the major problem is a deficiency of aggregate demand. So unlikely to be hugely beneficial to the economy, I would argue.
Yes, thanks. Just, I think Stephen makes a good point there about it depends very much how that capital expenditure is actually spent. Go and ask my members at the top of Leith Walker in the West End of Edinburgh who have had years of tram works if they think that major capital investment projects have been good for their business. I think we need to answer the question, what's the objective of the exercise? I get the point that investing significantly in our infrastructure is of course going to be good for business if we can get to where we want to go quicker and do business more efficiently. That is obviously a long-term gain. But if the name of the game is short-term economic stimulus, then we have to make sure that as much of that money, we get as big a bang for the buck, as Stephen says, as possible. And that means looking at how very carefully at how we procure and how we spend on those projects.
Okay. On this issue of procurement, I think Chick Brody wants to come in. Yeah, on the third sector issue as well.
Yeah. Before I ask, let me be rather naughty, because we are going into dark corners of government expenditure. How much do your organisations receive from the public purse?
Colin Borland? Nothing. John Downie?
Just less than £1 million. And core funding, we do deliver community jobs, for example, which is a £10 million project, and we take a management fee, but 99% of that goes out to organisations in the third sector. So we do have certain contracts we deliver.
So I meant directly or indirectly. David?
We're a membership organisation, so from time to time we may have organisations who are funded in whole or in part by the taxpayer who wish to join the CBI in order to get some sort of value out of that.
So you get nothing from Scottish Enterprise anymore?
Sorry?
You don't get any contribution from Scottish Enterprise anymore?
I understand Scottish Enterprise are members of the CBI at the moment, yes. Okay. So they'll take a value, they'll take a decision on value, whether they're getting value for money out of that. But the vast majority of our members, the overwhelming majority of our members are private sector companies. And as I say, from time to time, one or two public bodies or bodies that you or I might think of as public bodies, but maybe slightly autonomous, but maybe in receipt of taxpayers' money, might wish to join for a particular reason. Occasionally, public bodies and others wish to sponsor events that we do in order to promulgate messages, government initiatives and things like that. So it works from time to time. But the vast majority of our income comes from private sector companies, and that's who we represent at the end of the day.
Okay. I want to go... sorry. Oh, I beg your pardon. Sorry, Steve.
Funding like David's organisation comes from affiliated trade unions or members, we do receive funding from the Scottish Government to deliver 3 projects. Scottish Union Learn, which I understand is round about £1 million a year, but I'm not directly involved, so I'd have to get back to you with the exact figures. Our One Workplace Equality project, which is much lower levels of funding, I'm not sure what. And we also house the Close the Gap project, which is aimed at reducing the gender pay gap. We receive funding to house that project, but I'm not exactly sure how it all works out again, to be perfectly honest.
Okay, thank you. Just a question. I wonder if we come back to the public procurement and the procurement reform bill. In your submission, David, you indicate that the budget was a missed opportunity to signal a fresh direction on public service reform through contracting out the delivery of a far wider range of public services to the private and the third sectors. I wonder if each of you would care to comment on that. I don't want to get round to the small business bonus scheme, but I suspect we're about to. I wonder if you'd care to comment on where you think we missed the opportunity, and in looking at the budget, you know, where would you have, targeted spend in that area?
Well, at the risk of causing another fracture in the relationship with the STUC around the table, in terms of outsourcing, we think there's a great deal further that the Scottish Government can do on that front, and we gave evidence to the independent budget review, but also to the Christie Commission when they looked at this, and again I'm very happy to provide those submissions and those details to the committee afterwards if they would like that. So we think there is a missed opportunity on that front, that they could go a lot further in a number of areas in order to get better value for money from the public pound or the public purse, as it were. I was conscious, seeing Ms Armstrong here, I read the other day the CPPR report on the Scottish Government's budget, and it talked about, I think we were a third of the way through the cuts in resource spending. So it seems to me that they're actually a great opportunity over the next few years to make some of those changes going forward. And that's not to say that's going to generate immediate substantial sums of money, but I think it will put public services on a better, longer term financial footing, and obviously, hopefully, get those services fit for purpose going forward. This leaner time that we're in terms of public spending is going to be with us for many, many years to come. So that's really the key area.
Sorry, are you prepared to say what areas of public service that should be reformed?
We have done in our submissions to the Independent Budget Review and the Christie Commission. We've also done that in our evidence to the Finance Secretary, John Swinney. Some of the areas are to do with existing laws. Some are to do with ministerial decisions to restrict the right of the private or third sectors to go in and deliver services. So GP services, for example, there was a bill that Parliament supported a few years ago to restrict companies coming in to deliver that, even though many GP practices are themselves already privately provided. Hospital catering, hospital cleaning, roads management, maintenance. Actually, the Scottish Government has a good record on that. They've got the 4 contracts which they let out, but actually at a local level, the 32 councils are much more reticent about contracting that out to the private or the third sector. Contact centres, back office payroll. I know some of these phrases might upset Stephen, because I know he and I have debated some of these things in the past. We think there's a whole area, a whole range of different areas. I'm very happy to provide that to the committee afterwards. But that to us, that was the key area. And that would obviously free up money to spend on other things, as well as protect services, free up money to spend on infrastructure or skills, and possibly avoid some of the tax rises we've seen.
Back to the original question, which was about the procurement bill. Yeah. John Downie?
I think, before the draft of the procurement bill was announced, we had I think it was actually in this committee room, we had a round table with Alec Neil, who was then the minister responsible. And I think when the Minister laid out, the Cabinet Secretary laid out his ambitions for the bill in terms of building resilient communities, building local economies, redirecting the spend, actually the ambition and the vision for it, I think we all agreed with. We actually saw, you know, a process-orientated bill. I think we were a bit disappointed, and you know, I think we do have some issues with it, because it's actually about what are we trying to achieve, what is the outcome we want to achieve, because actually at the moment procurement is not delivering us the outcomes we kind of want. Yes, we are not using community benefit clauses effectively, we are not using the social impact as effectively as we could. And I know from Europe there's a much wider definition of social impact, and that's about protecting jobs, investing in local communities. There are ways, but actually the answer in some senses is we probably don't need a bill. It's actually if we have better culture and practice at how a bill's delivered, because the best bill in the world, if it doesn't change things at a commissioning level, is not going to make a big bit of difference. But I think the strategic point is it's about thinking how we use procurement to benefit Scotland perfectly well within the law. I mean, we've drafted our response and we've looked at other countries to see where they're using it much more effectively than we are. So I think, but the second part I think we'll be saying in procurement is you should be procuring, you know, the Forth Road Bridge, buying chairs, buying computers in the same way as you're buying people services. We need a kind of, call it a classic procurement approach to buying them, and actually a differentiated approach when you're buying people services, whereas that's social care and other things, because actually it is totally different. And the part of the problem is at the moment we're trying to do two things. And we're probably the only country in the world that doesn't have a law that deals with procurement below thresholds to make it easier and focused for, you know, public sector agencies to do something about that. So it's something else we'll be touching upon. So I think there's a great opportunity there. Whether we need a bill, we've got it, we need to take it forward and actually make it work for local businesses, local communities to retain money and jobs there. I think we can do it if we think about it in the right way.
Can I just follow? How would you change the culture?
Well, it's the biggest thing in terms of, it comes up in discussions about public services reform as well. I don't think defining, for example, you know, general duties and local authorities is going to, you know, and within the bill is going to make a difference to a lot of people. I think what we need to do is something we say quite a lot, partly, and I was saying it to the Health yesterday, a lot of this change agenda we're on in terms of public services reform, changing the dynamic, is actually about empowering people and communities. And actually, what we're going to do is, in organisations who are commissioning, think about, you know, what they want to achieve, but actually empowering people to make decisions and actually being able to take a risk. Yes, some things may go wrong, but actually we need to think that there's a cultural change there, and you could spend the whole day talking about the different theories of how you do cultural change, but we need to drive something better through the system. At the present moment, there's legislation there which, you know, officials are actually not using. I mean, if you take, for example, the simple example is if you're procuring new children's services, and you know, at this point here, you should be getting parents together, providers, other people you think, to think about what you want to achieve, what the best outcomes are. And further along the line, yes, those private sector providers, third sector providers will actually be there tendering for it, and that's perfectly fine. Now, you talk to officials at a local level, they say, we can't do that. But there's 2 paragraphs in the social care legislation says they can. But they're not using what they've got at the moment to actually deliver a better service. They're actually commissioning and designing services in isolation. Now, we need to think about putting users at the heart of public services reform and procurement, and that's the way we're going to change a dynamic and change the culture.
Colin Barlow.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think Mr Brodie and John have put their finger on the nub of the issue, and it's the question is not what we agree in our high-level strategies, but how do we translate that into really sensible, smart procurement approaches at that local purchasing manager level. And as you very quickly identified, there isn't a simple, easy answer to that. It is something that we're going to have to debate, and it's going to take an awful lot of work. But I can perfectly understand why. If I'm being told by my boss, take 10% out of that column, then it's very attractive for me to aggregate something together and ship it off to the lowest bidder, regardless of the wider economic impact of that decision, you know, 5-10 years down the line, because it's not coming out of my budget, I'm less interested. But it's still a bill that we, as you know, as a government, as taxpayers, are going to pick up. So I think for the procurement reform bill to be successful, that has to be tackled. We have made progress on a number of process issues, particularly in terms of how small businesses interact. But we do need to make sure that the overall agenda of saving money quickly has to be ameliorated, and not just at that highest level.
Yeah, I mean, we've been pressing the Scottish Government for many years now to take a more creative approach to procurement. We're the only national organisation who made submissions to this Parliament in 2005-2006 over the transposition of the last European directive. And interestingly, there's a new European directive on the way, which interestingly again might introduce more scope to introduce the kind of measures into public procurement. So the timing of this bill was not entirely helpful. But what we've never done is press the Scottish Government to introduce legislation. So we find ourselves in quite a funny position at this moment in time. We think the bill was weak, not hugely helpful, but we can't think of many legislative ways to improve upon it. I mean, most of what we would suggest is non-legislative. For instance, about 4 years ago now, the Scottish Government produced excellent guidance on community benefit, just a series of things people have to think about at early stages if they want to introduce community benefit into public procurement contracts. A really excellent bit of work. It's been insufficiently promoted, although I'm assured that this is changing at this moment in time, and now 300 procurement professionals have been trained in this guidance, so that is the kind of progress that we want to see. But we highlighted at the end of our submission the kind of disparity over the way the Scottish Government is presenting this bill and the reality of what is contained within the consultation round of the community benefits, so there seems to be a kind of lack of joined up thinking there as well. In regards to, you know, a lot's been said about culture, and culture is intimately related to resources. You know, if we want to do more and better and more creative things in this area, then they have to be properly resourced. And if you go back to the McClellan report now of 2006, I think that was one of his central conclusions, that we had to put more resources into procurement. I don't think that's happened. John mentioned Europe, and I think in John's submission it mentions France and how they do things differently. We need to distinguish between public procurement and other measures around about economic development. If you think in France in terms of offshore renewables, they're stipulating that 25% of the content must be local, and they're justifying it on climate change grounds, which is the kind of clever thing that France do. If you're actually looking at the public procurement processes, I mean, they stick rigidly to the letter of EU law. They're just more creative in its application. Back in 2004, Gordon Brown invited, I'm going to get the names, Ian Wood, ex-chief exec of Rolls-Royce, to do a major bit of work, essentially aimed at looking at what other countries were doing to cheapen EU procurement law. Now, they couldn't find anything in this at all. When they studied these other nations intimately, they looked at how they went about things, and, well, actually, they do stick to the letter of the law. They're just better at doing it than we are, you know. But again, you know, the whole culture of the civil service is different. More resources are in the system, and trying to replicate that in the short term is tremendously difficult.
Okay, one last point. Just associated with that, do you think the budget does enough to stimulate? If we look at small businesses, we have a startup rate of 36 per 100,000 people in the population. Does the budget address the creation of small businesses and the sustainability of small businesses? And if it doesn't, how would you suggest it does that?
Colin?
Yep. I think in terms of the start-up rates, there is some from the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor figures that actually show that we seem to have turned the corner. We do seem to be getting slightly better or slightly less bad, if I can put it that way. And there are a lot of resources that go into encouraging people to start up business. It has been one of Business Gateway's key responsibilities, and provided that continues to be funded as it has been in the previous under the previous regime, then we don't have an issue with that. The question about sustainability, I think, is the more interesting one, because survival really is the number one priority for a lot of people at the moment. So there are questions about, how do we reduce tax, or how do we reduce costs when we see things like energy bills and other costs increasing. And I have to say, not that I want to reopen the argument again, but the small business bonus has been incredibly important in that. And if you talk to businesses about that, that's exactly what they will tell you. The other question we have to look at is how do we support businesses at the key stages in their life cycle. And beyond start-up, there are probably two. That's when you move out of your back bedroom or your garage into your first premises, and when you take on your first member of staff. Now, there are provisions in this budget which look at making it easier to do both. There is I think it's been called the Fresh Start Initiative, whereby you can get a reduction in business rates if you move into take a premises that's been lying empty, take that back into use. That seems to make perfect sense. We'll need to look at the details to make sure it doesn't penalise people who are wanting to expand or, and also guarding against carousel movements, but I'm sure that can be overcome. And there's also the initiative using, I think it's ESF match funding to support small businesses to take on particularly young unemployed people. Now that's something that we're going to work very closely with the Minister for Youth Employment on, and we'll share some of the thinking that I spoke about before, about where the actual barriers to encouraging small businesses to take people on and how we suggest that they can be overcome.
Anybody else want to come in briefly? Stephen Boyd?
Briefly, oh dear. I will do my best. I'm not sure the budget does include many of those measures, but I would ask, should the budget include measures? Should we be focused on increasing the number of start-ups? I see no evidence out there that suggests to me increasing the number of start-ups is going to contribute to what the Scottish Government tells us is its fundamental purpose of increasing economic growth. Now, certainly some small businesses will contribute to innovation and growth, but many will not, and the ones that do are atypical. Most small businesses are underperforming, undersized. They confuse investors, and I think when they go down, as many of them invariably do, they take other small businesses with them, which I've seen at first hand when I worked for a small business. You asked me last year if I'd ever worked with a small business. Indeed I have, and I've seen the pretty devastating effect that small business can have on other small businesses when they go down in the back of business models that were never sustainable. So I would question about whether or not that should be our purpose. Secondly, in the small business bonus scheme, I mean, I could extend this for the rest of this session. I will not do it. I will simply say this time last year, after we'd been to the committee, we went away and did a bit of work looking at the best data set in small businesses in the UK, which is the business population figures, and we looked at the performance of Scottish small businesses, very small ones, 0 to 9 employees, compared to other nations and regions of the UK. And we looked at what the Scottish Government claimed for the small business bonus when it was introduced. I mean, their claims for the impact of this scheme were pretty ambitious, I think you could say, and in the paper we listed the various claims that were made for it. It was going to stimulate growth, it was going to stimulate employment, it was going to stimulate innovation. Well, looking at those figures, you can't see any evidence of that, because Scottish small businesses have underperformed in relation of number of businesses, turnover and number of employees since it was introduced. Now, I would emphasise that that data set does not tell the whole story, and we were all really hampered here by the Scottish Government's refusal to collect decent information on this scheme. So frankly, nobody really knows how well it's performing, and the Scottish Government could do more to deal with that problem. But what we don't need the FSB publishing a survey and telling us that this is evidence, manifestly is not. They're described by Jim Mather in Parliament as the principal architect of the scheme. They then go away and survey their own members, and I have to say the response rate to the survey was not exactly impressive. And then they try to draw conclusions about small businesses across the economy in the back of that survey. It's just not serious, and I think we have to recognise that and continue to respond to our serious bit of work with assertion is not really good enough.
Okay, I think we get the point.
I mean, the point is we've never had a response to the paper from any of the scheme supporters, and it's about time we did.
Well, I think it's only fair to let Colin Borland give
if I might,
a fairly, hopefully, I think this will be the last word on the small business scheme, but a brief response.
No, certainly, you don't need to take our word for it, although I would argue that our members know slightly more about what's happening in small businesses than people sitting looking at spreadsheets. However, if you look at one reliable set of data we've got is the Scottish corporate sector statistics, which are comparable over time. In Scotland, since 2008, since the financial crisis hit in 2008 to 2011, the number of small businesses has decreased by 1.4%. Comparable figures across the UK show that they have reduced, the number of small businesses has reduced by 4.5%. So more Scottish small businesses have survived in those years than businesses south of the border. Now, we need to be careful about how we use that figure, but I think that's fairly indicative on the basis of the STUC report, which I have read and which I have responded to. I have. I've certainly responded publicly.
Given as a response to
I was really asking how we encourage startups. I mean, while that might be interesting, it would have been good to get an answer, but does the budget do enough to stimulate startups?
You know, the focus of spending is obviously in a huge array of different areas, and Colin's obviously touched on, you know, business gateway and support there. I think there's a lot of emphasis obviously on small firms and so on, but actually what we're looking for, I think, is growth businesses that are actually going to generate substantial returns for the economy, substantial numbers of jobs. And there's a lot of, you know, publicly funded schemes available through Scottish Enterprise, which I think you mentioned earlier on, but also in the budget. Tourism, there's more money for tourism. Most businesses, as I understand, in the tourism sector, including our members, are small firms, so that's a positive. Interestingly, in terms of small businesses, even the empty property rates tax rise applies to them. We had a meeting yesterday. I took some members along to meet some MSPs, and they were from small business sector, and they were saying how much this is going to hold them back over the coming years if it comes into effect next spring.
Okay, can I move on and ask a related question about business rates? And if we can try and just leave aside the discussion on the small business bonus scheme, where I think we're probably not going to get a meeting of minds this morning on that. But on business rates more generally, the budget shows that there are forecast receipts from non-domestic rates over the next 2 years, increasing by 5% in real terms. This is at a time when, you know, the expected economic growth is very low, or indeed close to zero. What impact do you think these real terms increases in non-domestic rates will have on business decisions and the wider rate of economic growth? David?
Well, we've been very supportive of the Scottish Government over the years and some of the key issues, such as poundage rate parity with England. We also like the small firms rates relief scheme, to use a different name. We like the deferral scheme that the Finance Secretary has brought in. We're supportive of business improvement districts, the business rates incentivisation scheme. So a lot of good news. I've already touched on a couple of areas where we think the Scottish Government heading in the wrong direction on the retail levy and on empty property rates relief. In terms of the specific question about the forecast for revenues over the next few years, they do look pretty optimistic, given what we know about the state of the economy, given what we know about future economic forecasts. I think Stephen touched on this early on in his written submission to the committee. I think we also need to bear in mind that according to the Scottish Retail Consortium's evidence to this committee, almost 30% of rates revenues come from the retail sector. We've obviously just hit the retail sector with a levy at £95 million over the next 3 years. In addition to that, the Scottish Government are pressing ahead with enterprise areas, and there's a sort of rates discount element in there. So I think, yes, it could be quite challenging to meet that over the next few years. But I think the key thing for us, the key thing we have consistently made to government is retain poundage rates parity. We didn't have that in the early years of devolution, and that cost Scottish businesses dear.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the forecasts just look very, very ambitious. I mean, if you think at this moment in time, UK corporations are sitting on about £1 trillion of cash, which they see no reason to invest because there's no demand for goods and services. As I've already said, you know, there's conflicting views on the size of the output gap, but there's undoubtedly still an output gap there. And it's very difficult to see where the growth in business activity that would lead to a concomitant rise in rates revenue is going to come from.
Okay. Colin?
Yeah, obviously delighted to hear the STUC acknowledge that business rates aren't an absolute certainty, and the take will go up and down depending on economic circumstances. Yes.
Can we just park the point scoring for the time being?
Very quickly, it's important to recognise that about a quarter of our members don't pay any business rates because they don't have premises. Another quarter don't pay any because of the small business bonus scheme. Of the 50% who do pay it, it remains a significant cost. And when it's going up in the sort of mechanical way that it is by being linked to inflation increases, I mean, last year was a particularly large increase. This year it's smaller, then that is going to cause them difficulty. That's why we welcome the review of the operation of non-domestic rates and are contributing to that, and we very much look forward to the outcome of that before the scheduled next revaluation.
Okay, move on. Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I wonder if, first of all, I could just pick up on the issues that Rhoda Grant was raising about the revenue to capital shift. Sometimes this is talked about in terms of stimulus, and I think one or two witnesses today talked about this in terms of short-term stimulus. But it seems fairly clear to me that within a fixed budget, we have a certain amount of money to spend, and that can't provide what people would classically mean by stimulus. In many instances, the government isn't looking to raise significant revenue, for example, council tax frozen again. Given that some people have made the case that the problem with recovery is one of consumer demand, is there not a case for looking again at this question of the balance between spending money on capital projects, some of which are approved before they're even costed, like the AWPR, and the revenue budgets, for example, the pay policy? Can I ask, first of all, Stephen Boyd to comment on some of the arguments put across by PCS, for example, among other unions, that the emphasis should be on trying to provide a reasonable pay increase, at least so that pay doesn't continue to erode in real terms, and that gives people money to spend in the economy?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with your analysis. Not much to add to it, really. I mean, I think particularly if you're able to put more money in the pockets of the lower paid, and we would argue there's more the Scottish Government could have done round about that, then their marginal propensity to consume is higher, and you would see that. And if you look at the statistics, I mean, the reason the UK economy as a whole was underperforming, it's because of the lack of domestic consumption. I mean, yes, the Eurozone, etc., have had an impact, but I mean, it's the lack of domestic consumption for all the various factors we list in our submission we've already discussed this morning that's really holding back growth. So indeed, if we were able to put more money into the hands of lower paid public sector workers, then there's a very fair case to argue that in the short term that would have a greater stimulatory effect than shifting revenue to capital. And I think you remind me also of a point I didn't make earlier on that Mr. Biaggi and Mr. Robertson will remember from our discussion of Equal Opportunities Committee a couple of weeks ago, and that is revenue to capital also has serious gender implications, likely to put much more pressure on women's employment, which, although it's turned in the last 2 to 3 months, we've seen women's employment deteriorate very significantly over the last year, and it's likely, if anything, to boost male employment. So I just raise that as something people should be aware of.
Okay, and both STUC and SCVO, in your written submissions, you've gone on from those kind of issues to talk about whether GDP economic growth is actually the right priority. Within the context of the National Performance Framework, where we've seen declines over the years in the likelihood of achieving, for example, the solidarity targets, and now suddenly figures seeming to suggest that that's going in the opposite direction, that's improving, but nobody seems to know why. Could either of you expand on your comments about alternative approaches within that might be natural developments of the National Performance Framework, but which would represent a broader set of priorities that we should be achieving if we want to define what economic recovery means rather than just growth for growth's sake?
Yeah, I think our overall point on that, Patrick, was really about, sustainable economic growth is so measurable. Progress is not right. If you look at things which happened in terms of the Oxfam Humankind Index, which Parliament has debated, and you look at what people's priorities were and what they wanted for their communities, for their lives, for their children, it's much different from what we're seeing in terms of the economic framework there. And I suppose that's why our view is we need to really rethink, you know, the economy and have much more in terms of, you know, the social impact. You know, it's got to be there to address social inequality. We talk a lot about environmental impact and assessments, and that's not been taken into consideration in terms of economic growth as well. And actually, these things benefit the Scottish economy in a whole range of different ways, from our tourist industry, or as Stephen talks about in terms of, you know, the lower paid. We've had a long discussion with the STUC and others in terms of living wage in relation to procurement. You know, and actually that would put money into the hands of the lower paid and would stimulate, you know, spend in local businesses as well. So, but I think for us, it's about how do we then balance and bring in, you know, if we take the example, poverty and inequality in Scotland have got worse in the last 13 years. The National Performance Framework, you know, or the budget that this committee's, you know, investigating does nothing to address any of those issues. What we're saying here is I think we need to look at a much rounded picture in terms of what we're trying to achieve. And if we're taking a kind of people-based approach, a bottom-up approach to the economy, because the top-down is patently failed. Now, I recognise there is a balance. We need to think differently about this. And it is about more empowered citizens, because we want to be driving an economy that's not, because it's not going to be consumer-driven and demand-driven for the next few years, because household budgets are severely constrained. I mean, you know, the UK government was trumpeting last week the reduction in unemployment, you know, south of the border, but actually more people self-employed, you know, people from the public sector reclassified as private sector, lots of people disappearing from the benefits list. It was frankly, it was meaningless. You know, still unemployment is still the trend is actually going up, and actually, how do we change that dynamic? I think it's about how do we create jobs in local businesses, local third sector, and it's about that preventive agenda as well in terms of public services reform. So I think it's a complex picture, but it is about changing what we think we want from the economy, and we need a better and bigger debate on it.
You mentioned the environmental aspects of that in part of your answer. Can I ask you whether you, or indeed any of the witnesses, think it's remotely possible to say whether this budget achieves what's necessary in terms of the climate change emissions when we don't yet know what the policies are going to be? The government's legally required to come forward with a new report on its policies to make up the lost ground on the climate change emissions because the first annual target was missed. We've been told now that that report is probably not going to be out until the end of the year. Is it remotely plausible to look at this budget and say whether it achieves that objective, whether it's going to fund policies that haven't yet been defined?
In some sense, perhaps you might say actually the weather's got a bigger impact in those climate change targets than actually, you know, the budget has, because depending on, you know, with a fairly severe winter, that obviously probably affected some of that, and, you know, if we have a milder winter, you know, again. So I think it's difficult to say.
But knowing there's a new batch of policies required, and we don't know what they are yet, how can we tell whether they're being funded?
I would agree.
Okay. Any other witnesses want to come? Yeah.
And I think there's a fundamental tension here that, I mean, it's been wrestled with not just in Scotland but far beyond our borders between economic growth and sustainability. And it was interesting that the Cabinet Secretary chose to present the budget as the relentless pursuit of economic growth. I think they were the words he used, which is difficult to reconcile with the national performance framework. It's also difficult to reconcile with some other things that happen at the moment, such as the Better Regulation Bill, which is introducing a duty on environmental regulators, for instance, to promote economic growth, which we would argue introduces a conflict of interest into their core activity, which will be almost impossible to manage. But I mean, I think, you know, again, not just in Scotland, but beyond, you know, in the rest of the UK and beyond, we're not really close to having the kind of serious discussion about the degree of structural change required in the economy to achieve these very stretching and we would argue necessary targets. And we have, for instance, we signed a communique with the First Minister 3 years ago now in climate change, and as part of that we were encouraging the Scottish Government to do some pretty serious research and looking at the sectoral and geographical implications of the kind of shift you would need to achieve those targets. I mean, that's not yet been forthcoming, but we need to manage not also the opportunities which are undoubtedly there in renewables and other areas, but perhaps some of the negative consequences as well if we're going to take people along with us, and I don't think we're yet having that kind of discussion.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Just kind of on a slightly different tack, and really my first question was for Mr Lonsdale, having read your submission, in which, and part of what you referred to earlier about, you know, welcoming the capital investment in infrastructure projects and so on, would I take it then that you're quite critical of the UK government for making such drastic cuts to the capital part of the Scottish Government of an order of 30%?
Conscious of, you know, this, as we set out in our submission, conscious of the financial and economic backdrop, public sector set to borrow £250 billion over the next 3 or 4 years. Cuts are going to happen, or spending restrictions, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, but I mean, capital expenditure's either good or it's not good. You've said quite firmly in your written submission that it's good. Therefore, do you condemn the UK government for making such a big cut to the Scottish Government's capital budget?
I was coming on to that. I was trying to give a broader context.
I think we all understand in this room the broad context. Could you just answer the question, please?
I will answer the question as best I can in the way I choose, and I'm conscious of your invitation for me to condemn them. You know, as I said in the submission, we've been very, very clear that where the public sector are going to be spending money, then we would like them to spend money on infrastructure, and we have called on the UK government to spend more on infrastructure over and above what they've said so far. They're doing some other things, many of which I think replicate what's happening north of the border in terms of looking at other ways of funding infrastructure. Here in Scotland we have TIFs, we have the National Housing Trust model as well. The UK government, I think, are looking at a sort of finance guarantee type scheme. Yes, we'd like them to spend more money on infrastructure. Yes, we'd like them to spend a greater proportion of their spend on infrastructure. The sad reality is that politicians, governments of the day, when it comes to difficult decisions in terms of money, in a downturn, if there's less money available, capital tends to be the first port of call, or an early port of call, for where the axe is applied rather than revenue, because obviously you can put off capital expenditure programs, you can put off Western Aberdeen, Western peripheral routes and all the rest of it, and it's much more, it's much less enticing for politicians to cut, you know, free bus passes, free this, that and the next thing. So yes, we'd love them to spend more. You know.
And just to move on to one other part of your evidence here, you indicated you had a kind of antipathy towards increasing planning fees. Now, the committee have been through, you know, another inquiry where we've, you know, had the case for increasing planning fees demonstrated in terms of improving the efficiency of the planning system, so that developers can go from, you know, pre-planning to consented to, you know, getting their shovels out, as it were, quite quickly. So it's to improve the efficiency and I guess to a certain extent the uncertainty of the planning system. So I was a wee bit surprised that you would indicate antipathy towards increasing planning fees in your written submission.
I don't think we actually do make that point, truth be told, just looking at the point here. In fact, the only thing we say in the submission is that the Scottish Government is currently considering proposals to increase planning application fees. Planning application fees went up by 10% the year before last. The Scottish Government are consulting on that. Very happy to send you a copy of our submission to the Scottish Government earlier this year on that subject, and actually we made the point that our members would be supportive of an increase of sorts in planning application fees if they felt there was a commensurate improvement in the quality of service they were given. And I think that's where it begins to fall down.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. Sorry if I've misunderstood that then. And if I can move on, convener, just one question now for Mr. Boyd, and it's really one of the things that slightly rang alarm bells with me in what you were saying just earlier on this morning about leakage from the Scottish economy. And it gave me some concern, because I think that, you know, obviously in an interconnected world where we trade with other countries, there's always going to be a certain amount of leakage. Equally, there is inward investment, and I think Scotland has done very well, and particularly over the last year or so by comparison with other parts of the UK in inwards investment. And I know there is this tendency when times are hard for countries to adopt a kind of protectionism. But I'm surprised, you know, if the STUC's position really is that kind of protectionist and not a broader kind of internationalist approach. Would you care to just elaborate a wee bit on what you mean by leakage?
Absolutely, and no, I mean, we have to be realistic. I mean, the Scottish Government couldn't be protectionist even if it wanted to. I mean, I think what I was trying to get at with my earlier comments was the debate we have in Scotland about infrastructure spending and shovel-ready projects is not terribly sophisticated, and we tend to assume that the entirety of the spend in infrastructure will be an absolute benefit to the Scottish economy. Now, I'm saying there will be leakage in here. Now, I'm not blaming the Scottish Government for the fact there will be leakage in here, but I'm thinking, you know, in terms of the specific discussion we were having at the time round about the relative benefits of shifting revenue to capital and the possible disbenefits of that, I was arguing we don't have the information to hand to be able to make a proper adjudication on that, because we don't know the degree of leakage. And I think you make a very important point about inward investment. I mean, it's a point we raise in our submission that the abolition of the RDAs in England has been hugely beneficial to the Scottish economy. It's been massively beneficial to STI and Scottish Enterprise, who have seen a tier of competition ripped out the international environment, and I think it's all to their benefit that they've been able to make the most of that, which is why we're raising also in our submission some concerns about the possible pressures in their budgets as well.
And just one final question again for Mr. Boyd, that you mentioned. Sorry, and this really is my last one. You mentioned some concern about the national performance framework targets, and particularly the one to achieve similar rates of growth to the other EU small countries, and you felt, I think, that target is not achievable, or if it is achievable, it's only achievable because growth has been diminishing in these other countries. But do you feel there's something intrinsically wrong with Scotland, some problem that's that we can't overcome, that would prevent us from realising similar growth to these other small European countries?
It's not concerned so much about that target, but we've been saying this since the target framework was introduced. I mean, I think there was a real degree of ambition in that target framework that we were quite enthusiastic about. The introduction of the golden rules, as they were described at the time, on sustainability, cohesion and solidarity, I think we were terribly appreciative of. But I mean, again, the debate is not always as being as sophisticated as it could be, and I think comparing Scotland to certain other small economies over a certain time period did not lead to a proper appreciation of Scotland's strengths and weaknesses, and also the strengths and weaknesses in those other nations. And I think the events of the last 4 to 5 years have really highlighted that. They've highlighted the lack of sustainability in some of these nations. You could argue over that time frame or over a longer time frame, they've also highlighted some of Scotland's strengths. So it's not that we thought the target was, terribly damaging in any way. It just didn't lead to a properly, a duly sophisticated discussion about the nature of the Scottish economy and how it compared to these other nations. So I just don't find it terribly helpful. And, as we've said, it could very well be achieved through low growth in these other nations rather than increasing growth in Scotland. So what does that really tell us about performance? What does it tell? What are the lessons in there for policy moving forward? It's very difficult to identify terribly effective ones, I think.
Okay, thank you.
John Downie, yeah.
I think part of the problem relates to Chick Brodie's question earlier on about part of, you know, Stephen's point about a simple comparison is, you know, the way those countries are governed, their culture, their democracy, the way different things are embedded, particularly local decision making. You know, it's difficult to make a comparison on economic growth. I think there's certainly lessons we can learn from that, but I think, I mean, it is quite difficult to make a comparison, say, because we're a small country, our growth is actually going to be the same as other small countries. We can get there, but I think it's going to take a big change in how we rebalance our own economy.
Okay, thank you.
We're not, sorry, I just want to comment on that though. We're not conflating two different things here. I mean, the target was expressed, I think, as growth generally measured in GDP. Now, the question as to whether or not we should be measuring growth in that way or success in that way, I think it's a different one, is it not?
I don't think we should be measuring it in that way, because actually GDP doesn't mean wealth, for example. It doesn't mean, you know, social sustainability or environmental. Actually, GDP is actually quite a blunt objective of measuring our country and our community. So I think that's the debate I think we have to have.
Yeah, yeah. I would agree with you, but we just...
I think we probably need to move on. Fair enough, thank you. Dennis Robertson.
Good morning, gentlemen. Earlier, before I get to my question, earlier on, Patrick Harvey mentioned the AWPR. I would hope that people would welcome the fact that the AWPR will probably create 14,000 new jobs, which I think is probably a fantastic incentive in our economy. I really want to come on to the sort of skill. Do you think, within the scope of the budget, and I think there's a general agreement that things are very tight, but within the scope of the budget, does it afford enough opportunity within the sort of skills to address some of the problems within the skills market? And from an all-male panel of witnesses here today, does it do enough to address the gender question?
Stephen Boyd.
So this the last time I answered the question like that, I was in the front page of all the papers the next day, so I'll need to choose my words particularly carefully. I think we need to develop the whole debate round about skills. I mean, it's still, despite a lot of good work that the Scottish Government was undertaking about 3 to 4 years ago in what we were calling the skills utilisation agenda, it's still very focused on improving the stock of skills. And I'm concerned about some of the language round about, you know, the debate at this moment in time that, you know, the assumption is still there that if we improve the stock of skills at this moment in time, we will necessarily see a related boost to GDP growth. I mean, I think when demand is as low as it is in the economy at this moment in time, we cannot assume that that chain effect will take place. And I think we have to get back to discussing how we can better use the stock of skills that we already have at this moment in time. In relation to your question, I think we've had our concerns, as you know, I know Colin's expressed in his submission as well about the situation with FE colleges at this moment in time. But in very broad terms, I think the balance of skills investment, and we would always like more, I think is probably about right.
And on the gender question, just a bit,
the gender question.
Bit further on the gender question, the issues.
Yeah, but that's where I got myself into trouble the last day.
Yes, I know.
That's why he's asking you.
So, I mean, I think I would make the same points I made to the Equal Opportunities Committee a few weeks ago. I'll just make sure I make them in a different way. Too many of our industrial sectors are still pretty much closed shops towards women. There are an awful lot of activities currently taking place, and we've seen a very welcome initiative announced by the First Minister at the Women's Employment Summit last month about trying to encourage school-aged children, female school-aged children, to look at careers in science, technology, engineering and maths. The situation at this moment in time, we're currently about 80% of the women who train in those subjects don't go on to pursue careers in those areas. It's a major concern, particularly when, you know, some sectors such as energy, who tell us they have a skill shortage at this moment in time, are the sectors where women are most underrepresented at this again. So I think we're not necessarily looking at, I think as we discussed the Equal Opportunities Committee, we're not looking at major spend in this area. We're just making sure that women are availed of the opportunities that are available elsewhere. In particular in areas like modern apprenticeship, we begin to see the gender balance be much more fairly distributed over some areas, renewable energy, engineering, etc., but at the moment are massively dominated by
But
men.
you do welcome any spend within the budget in addressing those problems?
Any spend would be very helpful, but I mean, again, we have to recognise that it's not just a matter of spending here, it's about making sure that the spend that is already there is much more fairly distributed.
Anything else? Colin Borland.
Yep, thank you. I think to deal with the gender issue first, in tough economic times, when you see particularly larger corporations beginning to look at redundancies, what are the sort of roles that tend to go in those first and second rounds of redundancies as people are looking to slim down? Are they in possibly areas such as marketing and hospitality and other areas which may have a larger proportion of women doing those jobs compared to men? So I think it's possibly not surprising that there is a particular problem round about female unemployment and women losing their jobs. One of the things I think we could be doing more on is encouraging more women to consider the route of self-employment. Now, we do actually, well, we do badly on that by any measure, but we do slightly less badly in terms of our membership in Scotland than the UK average. That's possible because self-employment is, you know, it's completely flexible. You can fit it in around other tasks and duties, which, you know, which still unfortunately do tend to predominantly fall to women. So I think we could maybe do something round about that and making it easier. I know there are a lot of good things like Women into Business who promote that, but we could possibly look at that one way of offsetting some of that. The second point was about the skills agenda and is enough money getting into that. Again, to return to my opening remarks, I'm less interested, we're less interested in the raw amounts of money that is going into, for example, SDS, rather than how they're spending it. I think, to be fair to SDS, they are doing a lot of work at the moment to improve the employer offer, but I think even they would accept that there is a way to go. Very important that people who want to improve themselves and improve their job prospects have access to that information. But if I want to upskill the workforce, or if I spot someone who's got a real bit of talent and I think, right, how can I move them on to the next level? I really need an easy resource I can go to there, and also one that fits in with my business, because the sort of jobs that are created in most or many small businesses don't fit neatly into a particular employment category. It's usually someone who is a salesman but also looks after the warehouse and has to be, you know, is responsible for health and safety, and also does a little bit of also answers the phone. These jobs are more difficult to sort of engage. If you employ those sort of people, it's more difficult for you to engage with that system. I pick up on Stephen's point about FE colleges. They are crucially important, and we would like to see them doing a little bit more. And I appreciate that funding is tight, but a little bit more with engaging with the local business population, so they are providing not just courses that happen to be popular amongst the local cohort, but courses that very closely, or courses that are going to give them a realistic chance of a rewarding career within the local economy at the end of it.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
I think addressing the gender issue first, I think it's an interesting one. If you look at the stats this year in terms of third sector employment, overall employment in the sector has been down about 10%, so we're sitting at about 137,000. And actually the large organisations have kind of cut staff, medium size and smaller managed to retain. But I think the interesting thing is if the number of vacancies in the sector this year have actually increased, interestingly, but it's actually jobs that are 3 or 4 days a week. Now, part of that's budget pressures, but actually part of it is, you know, a flexibility. And I think we don't build in some bigger private sector organisations enough flexibility into the system where actually we're retaining people in the workforce, because actually the cost of actually losing someone there, having to recruit, you know, I mean, is incredible for any organisation. So I think we can do more. Any budget spend, I think, would be welcome. In terms of skills and training, I mean, there is, you know, the focus on, very much a focus on, it's all about skills and training. Well, great, you can do a skills and training course, but actually without a job at the end of it, or without a job potentially at the end of it, you know, what is the value in that? And I think that's why I think from our point of view, it is about programmes like Community Jobs Scotland, where people are getting the opportunity to work in a business and get and lever in training at the same time. Now, Colin mentioned, you know, skills development in Scotland, saying they're getting there, but they've been getting there for the last 5 years, as far as I can see, and we're spending £180 million a year on them. I would question whether that's actually value for money, and actually put 30 million into an enhanced community programme and create 16,000 jobs in the third sector, if we're looking at where the money's got to come. And I do think, you know, we have a very focused target on modern apprenticeships. You know, modern apprenticeships are actually quite hard to get, you know, so from a lot of people in the most vulnerable and poorest communities, they need to go on a jobs journey to actually get to the stage where they're ready to get a modern apprenticeship. So I think our strategy needs to be much more nuanced around this and actually see that people are maybe taking a job in the third sector, giving them experience, because all the results from Community Jobs Scotland, happy to send a committee, shows that people move on to self-employment and they move into a job for over 40%, and they move into college and university over 40%. Very positive outcomes. So actually we need to be focusing on that. But I think there is a case for looking at definitely some of the skills and enterprise agencies' budgets, because I really can't see we're getting a bang for our buck on them.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Certainly having sat in congestion on North Anderson Drive a couple of weeks ago for the best part of an hour, I could fully endorse your comments on the Western Peripheral route. In skills, we have highlighted a number of the positives in our budget submission in terms of energy skills, academy and the employer recruitment initiatives. I think you know, there are some positive things there. In terms of gender, you know, that's a much wider question, and obviously as an organisation we think that's important. Our chairman is a female, our previous chairman was a female, our record on having female chairmen before that was non-existent, and obviously as an organisation we've sought to try and address that, encouraging across the UK more women to take up senior positions in business, and that's just a small microcosm of the whole wider agenda.
Can I maybe ask a final question on a slightly different subject that picks up on John Downie's last comment? We're taking evidence next week from the enterprise agencies who've seen quite a substantial reduction over the years in real terms in their budget, and are facing in the budget for next year another real terms decrease. What is your view on the funding settlement for the enterprise agencies going forward? Is it appropriate? Is it too much? Is it too little? Is it going to have a negative impact on their ability to do what they need to do to help grow the economy? Interested just to get your thoughts on that briefly, if we can, given the time.
Yeah,
Colin.
Very briefly, under the current setup, obviously SE and to a lesser extent High have little direct influence on our members. So in terms of what the actual overall funding level is, it's not something on which we have particular concerns one way or indeed the other.
I think it links back to our earlier discussion about, you know, the National Performance Framework, rethinking the economy and actually focusing on, you know, more positive social and inequality outcomes through what we do. I mean, if you look at, you know, the remit of HIE and compared to Scottish Enterprise with a much more socially based community, it's about building growth in local communities as well, and you see the stark differences. I think you know, that needs to be questioned. I'd like to see what HIE is doing in terms of Scottish Enterprise as well, because I think they need to shift in the balance. I accept their budget has been cut and the organisation has changed significantly in the last few years, and the focus, as Stephen said, on bringing inward investors in, which, yes, always looks great when we announce 500, 300, 1,000 jobs, but you know, the overall economic value, as Stephen was saying, but some of these other issues, it needs to be assessed very critically whether that is where we should be investing.
Stephen.
And it's a concern to us, the pressure on Scottish Enterprise's budget. And I think, you know, I hear what John's saying, but the enterprise agencies are not to blame for their budget, you know, so we're in danger here of being critical about Scottish Enterprise not doing stuff we would like them to do, but the Scottish Government hasn't asked them to do. I think in terms of what they've been asked to do, I hear all the time from businesses about how important the assistance that they get in industry sectors I'm involved with directly, such as energy, such as aerospace, defence and marine, particularly textiles. I mean, the work that Scottish Enterprise has done in the textile sector the last few years, you know, a sector that's not discussed particularly much at this moment in time, but if Scottish Enterprise had not been there in supporting films, you know, we'd need even less jobs and output in that sector than what we have now. The concern, as we highlight in our written submission, is that the efficiency savings, particularly through the strategic forum, are extremely pressing. And our concern would be, I'm not saying this is happening, but we would worry that it would be these efficiency savings would not be derived from efficiencies, shared services, etc., which would also be a concern to us, but might end up impinging on some of the very important projects such as EMEC, etc., the enterprise networks are responsible for. So we've got a real concern there.
Let me ask, as a follow-up to that. I mean, Scottish enterprise in particular are very focused on high-growth industries, yet the great majority of people in Scotland are not employed in high-growth industries, they're employed in other sectors. Do you think that focus is right? Should Scottish enterprise be doing more to help improve productivity in the non-high-growth sector?
Well, if the fundamental purpose of the Scottish Government is to increase overall GDP growth, now I'm not saying that's right, set aside from a moment whether that's right or wrong, then the remit of Scottish enterprise focusing on high growth, high productivity companies is exactly right. I don't think that's really challengeable. I think the wider issue is, are we providing sufficient levels of support to other businesses? I mean, I think Scottish enterprise do. We have to recognise that as well. It's not only high growth businesses they work with. You look at the work that the Scottish Manufacturing Advisory Service has done over the last few years with companies of all, and I know that Mr Brodie did an event in here last night in manufacturing. The work that particular organisation has put into businesses of all sizes and all ranges of productivity has been massively helpful to the Scottish economy. So we need to recognise the full gamut of what Scottish enterprise do, and we need to recognise how neatly it fits into the Scottish Government strategy. Whether or not you believe that that is the right overall strategy and the enterprise network's role within it is correct, I think is a debate we need to set aside.
Okay. David Lonsdale.
I thought Stephen's last answer was excellent, and I think I would concur with most of it in terms of, I think if we're serious about rebalancing the economy, both in terms of, having more trade externally and more investment, then, that's central to that agenda. In terms of inward investment, I think that is important. This committee had an inquiry a couple of years ago into exporting an inward investment, and one of the findings, if I recall rightly, was that actually companies that come in here to Scotland and invest are actually more likely to export. So I think there's a lot of benefits in terms of benchmarking exports and employment. That's not to say that some of them don't up sticks quite quickly thereafter, but I guess that's the risk you play to.
Right. In that case, I think that concludes our evidence session. Thank you to our panel of witnesses for coming along. It's been very helpful. And we'll have a short suspension to allow a changeover. Yes. Right, if we can reconvene, can I welcome our second panel of witnesses, Norman Kerr, who's Director of Energy Action Scotland, and Dr. Dan Barlow, Head of Policy at WWF Scotland. Before we get into questions, would you like to say something by way of brief introduction on the budget, Mr. Kerr?
I think very briefly, Convener, thank you. First of all, to say we're delighted that the committee has returned to this topic from its earlier evidence session this year, where its recommendation was for £200 million per annum to be spent. And while we have that in the budget, I think there's some discussion we can have about how secure that £200 million is. For example, the actual figure available from the government is £65 million, and the money that they hope to raise is £135 million from the energy companies. And in Energy Action Scotland's view, that's not a given. That is not secured money. So I think we may, I hope, touch on that. And finally, I would like to say that I would hope that the committee would return to this topic perhaps in 6 months' time, not just to look at the recommendations that they make, but actually the impact of the programmes that fall out of your recommendations. So it's not just about the money, it's about the impact of how that money is spent. Thank you.
Thank you. Dan Barlow.
Similarly, very much welcome the opportunity to come and speak to the committee about the Scottish budget. I mean, I think the two things I guess I'd like to refer to initially is first, I welcome the fact that the committee have identified the importance of looking at the budget in relation to the broader set of outcomes that a national performance framework represents, and I think that's very important. And for us, under that theme, of course, the low carbon economy is one of the key outcomes that we need to be securing in Scotland, and we're particularly interested to look at how the budget and the Climate Act implementation plan actually work together. And we welcomed the committee identify last year that this was both important, but also acknowledging that there were some concerns as to whether the budget did fully fund the Climate Act implementation plan. And hopefully in this session we can draw out some of the issues that we think still exist, because we still have concerns that the budget, as proposed at the moment, doesn't give us confidence that we will meet all the targets established in the Climate Act, which are clearly very important. On the issue of homes, that's one of the key priority work areas for WWF, very important in terms of emissions, critical role to play improving the energy efficiency of those if we're going to cut climate and address fuel poverty. So I think we're very interested to explore some of the issues around the levels of funding that are available to support energy efficiency in homes, particularly in relation to some new analysis that WWF have just published this morning, which looks at the scale of the gap that exists in the level of funding, both public and private, that we think will be necessary to meet the fuel poverty and climate targets that the Scottish Government's committed to.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's go into questions. I think maybe start by looking at some of the fuel poverty issues if we can, and I'll start with Rhoda Grant.
Can I ask if you believe that the budget does enough to tackle fuel poverty?
I think the simple answer to that is no. This committee identified 200 million, I think, as a minimum spend moving forward per year. And the point I made in my opening comments, only 65 million of that is coming from the Scottish Government. When we last debated this, Energy Action Scotland's view was that the government should lead on that, and that the government should commit at least 100 million. That was as a minimum. So I don't believe that the budgets are secure enough to tackle fuel poverty as they stand. The 135 million that is to come from the energy company obligation is quite a challenge if we are to gain that every year for the next 3 or 4 years. I think that's a very big ask. It's not the level of funding that we've managed to secure up until now, and I don't see how that we will be able to secure it without significant support from the Scottish Government just now.
I think I would just add to that to identify that we fully agree with that, and the analysis that we've published today suggests that in total we need to see a sum of something around 6.3 billion spent if we're actually going to improve homes, ensure that fuel poverty is eradicated in Scotland by 2016. Now, of course, we're not suggesting that that all has to come from public money. We recognise a large proportion of that will need to come from private investment. But we do think there's a critical role for the government to ensure that it does spend some significant public money to support that goal. And of course, that will also help leverage in the private money as well. And at the moment, the current trajectory, we're going to see about £500 million spent over that time period, which is in the region of a tenth of what the total investment will need to be if we are committed. And of course, that target is now only a few years away. So I think it is very important that we really do increase the seriousness or the attention that we give to the need to up the effort we direct in actually improving the quality of our housing stock and ensuring that we can meet that target.
What measures would you want to see in the budget that would have a real impact on fuel poverty?
So I think for us, the Scottish Government have committed to the implementation of a kind of national retrofit programme. We think that is very helpful. That's the right way to go, and we think that builds on the Scottish Government's experience of developing the Universal Home Insulation Scheme, which ensures that we can apply insulation in a coherent and cost-effective way. But we can only roll that out at the scale that we need if there is more funding available to enable more people to access that. And there also, we think, need to be, we think the government needs to look clearly at how they can support individuals and local authorities in making the Green Deal work, as that comes forward. Obviously, this is a UK mechanism, but the government has committed some money in the form of some cash back to act as an incentive to people to take up the Green Deal, and that's very welcome. But I think on its own that won't be enough, and we'll need to look at whether there's some support that could be given to, for example, local authorities working together to find a way that makes the Green Deal actually deliver successfully, bring in the number of properties into that project, to be able to access that funding that's available, and there may be some kind of seed funding that is important to develop, for example, a business plan which shows how the Green Deal and eco-funding could work together.
I think Dan's correct. It is about joining funding together. However, Energy Action Scotland's view is that the Green Deal will not address fuel poverty. It's not aimed at the fuel poor market, and that's where we see the Scottish Government having to take the lead. The Universal Home Insulation Scheme, again, as Dan mentioned, is very welcome, but we are talking about a 10-year rollout. So by 2022, we hope that the National Retrofit Programme will have covered all homes in Scotland. The fuel poverty target is 2016, and the other targets that we talk about in terms of carbon emissions, 2020. So we're already saying that we are constructing a programme that will come to an end after the target dates for the eradication of fuel poverty and for climate change.
Thanks.
Thank you. Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. This committee and the Finance Committee last year made comments in our budget reports about the need for read across between the report and policies and proposals under the Climate Change Act and the budget. What I've got in front of me is a letter from John Swinney to subject committee conveners dated yesterday, but I gather it arrived with the committee at 10:15 p.m. yesterday, so it's just about possible you've not had a chance to have a look at this and absorb its contents. This committee raised this issue about read across between the budget and the RPP again recently, with John Swinney looking for reassurance that this would be better, and I've made enough points of order about the same issue recently to lose friendship with the presiding officer for good. What we've got now in this letter is Mr Swinney acknowledging that there's a need to take steps to improve the presentation of budget information relating to climate change policies. The Scottish Government has prepared a summary document that draws together the details of the budget lines across the spending review period that support delivery of greenhouse gas emission reductions. Rather than strictly according to ministerial portfolio, it's grouped according to the main sections set out in Low Carbon Scotland, the RPP1. And it says this is intended to help committee members more easily read across between RPP1 and the draft budget. Isn't Mr Swinney utterly missing the point here, given that he's legally required, because of the failure to meet the emissions target in the first annual target, he's legally required to come forward with a new set of proposals and policies to make up the lost ground, not just for future years, but to make up the lost ground in year one. Isn't it bizarre that we're being asked to look at a budget and decide whether it meets these climate change objectives before we know what the policies are going to be to help us make up this lost ground in year one?
Dr. Barlow.
It clearly is difficult finding a way where we have the information presented at the right time which enables appropriate scrutiny of the RPP2 and the budget. I think for us, we would suggest that it's going to be very important that this committee does scrutinise the RPP2 when it becomes available and looks across at the budget, and if there does identify issues where it thinks there isn't sufficient funding, does challenge the government on that.
It will be after we've finished our budget scrutiny.
So it does make it quite difficult in this year to read across. Of course, it will enable that scrutiny process for the next few years to look at how the RPP2 is funded by future budgets. But I agree, for this year, that does make it quite difficult. But we do know this year already that one of the reasons we failed the 2010 target was because emissions from transport and homes are greater now than they were 20 years ago. So I think we know enough to look at some sectors to see, well, actually, we're not making enough progress in those key sectors. And I think, therefore, they would identify that, or that suggests that it's clearly appropriate for the committee to, I think, look particularly in detail at those sectors in the budget this year and take a view as to whether they think the commitments made in the budget under homes and transport are likely to both deliver the future targets but also compensate for that shortfall that we saw in the 2010 target, and recognise that those are two sectors where emissions need to be put on a very different trajectory.
I'm glad you've mentioned those two specifically, because when I look through this summary document, and I appreciate you haven't had a chance to see this yourselves, which is regrettable. When I look through this, I see a section on energy in terms of renewables, community energy, grid enhancement, fossil fuel levy and so on. I see a section on the Scottish enterprise agencies. I see a section on policy, things like the contribution of the UK Climate Change Committee. And I see a section headed low carbon economy, which does mention energy efficiency advice, but is only £10 million, and so clearly doesn't include the National Retrofit Programme. So it's not including the National Retrofit Programme. None of this includes any of the other work to actually roll out the delivery of insulation programmes, for example, and it says not one word about transport. Would you say that that's a really disappointing document to be looking at if we're looking to try and see where the changes necessary in the Scottish budget to achieve improvements in those two sectors specifically?
Just before you answer that question, I think it's only fair to, on a point of clarification, I've just been advised by the clerks that the document we have before us is only a summary document, and what the clerks have done is print out the pages in the summary relevant to the remit of this committee. So there will be other pages, for example, dealing with things like transport. We just do not have them available to us this morning.
Well, which again makes it very difficult to have the conversation. But given that, you know, certainly in terms of low carbon economy, there's nothing there on housing, and the National Retrofit Programme clearly does have a relevance to energy. Would you agree that there's a real problem in using achieving the kind of read across that both this committee and the Finance Committee said last year was necessary, and particularly if we're going to look at how we close this gap, how we make up the lost ground in year one of the annual targets?
I think this year, given the timing of the development of RPP2 and when that's going to be available for scrutiny in the budget, there clearly is a difficulty in ensuring that that read across is there and the committee having the information it needs to be confident in whether the budget will deliver the RPP2. Obviously, I haven't been able to look at the document you've referred to. It would strike me as very strange if it hadn't identified specific actions that were going to be taken in those sections of housing and transport, and whether there were additional measures that were going to be brought forward to make up for the fact that emissions from those sectors aren't reducing at the rate they need to if we're going to deliver the climate targets. And I would urge the committee to look at that and obviously raise that with the Cabinet Secretary.
I think the committee do need more information than the brief glance I've had through there. It is disappointing, as Patrick Harvey has stated, that there's nothing to demonstrate how we regain the ground that we've lost. And I go back to the estimates, you know, that we made some years ago, and the spending over that period from 2006 until now has not achieved the desired results. So we are falling further behind, and it would have been useful to see from the Cabinet Secretary how the intention was of making up that lost ground. As Patrick Harvey has said, I've not seen it in the brief glance there, but I take the convener's comment that it is a summary document, and I would be hopeful that the committee would be furnished with further documentation to explain that.
Okay, Dennis Robertson.
Thank you very much. Really, just it's a supplementary to that. I think we all accept that the targets were there, and that we didn't meet them. And the Minister, Paul Wheelhouse, has actually given, I think, a fairly clear understanding to some of the mitigating reasons as to why not, especially with the very severe winter that we had. Only yesterday, the Minister, Paul Wheelhouse, gave a commitment to engage both with the other ministers, Margaret Burgess of Housing and Keith Brown of Transport, to look at this whole agenda. So it's going across the various portfolios of the ministers, and I think there is an acknowledgement that we have to do that. So, you know, I think there's a lot of positives coming forward, and really, I think my question is that do we accept that, you know, you can do your best to try and ensure that you're going to meet the target. If you have a severe winter like we had, there's also an acceptance that there could be mitigating circumstances as to why you don't. And again, with regard to the housing, in some of our remote and rural areas, it's, you know, what we have at the moment in terms of insulation doesn't meet the requirements in those remote and rural areas. And perhaps that's one of the other reasons as to why, you know, targets can't be met sometimes.
I think there's a number of points I would like to make in response to Mr Robertson's comments there. It was interesting when you mentioned the ministers that were meeting, Mr Robertson, that you didn't include Mr Neil as Health Minister, or Cabinet Secretary with responsibility for health.
I think it was just a point that Mr Wheelhouse actually mentioned yesterday in the Chamber, that he had intentions of meeting both the Housing and Transport Ministers to take the subject forward. He may well be seeing the Cabinet Secretary, but as of yesterday he mentioned in Chamber those specific ministers.
For the sake of the record, he also did mention the NHS in response to a question from me.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, because one of the things that we do need in terms of read across is with severe winters, and I don't think it will be any surprise to any of the committee that this winter is also being forecast as a severe winter, that we have singularly ignored the severe winter advice for a number of years and have continued to choose the low-hanging fruit in the central belt as where we put our main endeavours. I think we do need to widen that portfolio and bring in health for a discussion and look at when we have, and again the Cabinet Secretary for Health last year commented on excess winter deaths, when we have 2,500 excess winter deaths every year on a good year, then surely the warning bells are there that we should be investigating the cause as to why we have excess winter deaths that relate to cold, damp homes. And I'm still not seeing the read across between departments in that. There is a headline in the budget that talks about £10.3 million being made to accelerate energy efficiency projects across the public sector and specifically in the NHS. But there's nothing that says that the NHS should be engaged with its patients to help deliver to them a better understanding of the provision of cold damp or warm homes as opposed to cold damp homes. So I think we've still got quite a bit to do in terms of read across, and it is about choices that we need to make.
I think just a couple of points. First, we very much welcome the actions that the Minister's taken to meet with his colleagues to discuss these issues, and I hope that as part of that discussion he will also be discussing with them the issues around the budget and their budget spend and whether there are opportunities for them to ensure that the way that the budget is allocated within their sphere of responsibility is going to help us cut emissions. I think the adverse weather that has been used as the reason for missing the target in some ways is a risk of being a slight cop-out, because we of course need to be able to plan for a range of weathers and ensure that we are confident within whatever the weather is that Scotland has, that we will cut our emissions. And ultimately, if we've got houses that can cope with cold weather, the only thing that benefits is individuals who have lower fuel bills as a result of that. So there's difficult to see any disbenefit from having very good housing quality. The other issue with that, of course, it doesn't particularly explain why transport emissions would go up, because you have a particularly cold winter. The third area I would draw your attention to is that the RPP document itself identifies that if we rely on the policies alone, up until 2022, there will just be one annual target that we can guarantee we'll meet. If we ensure that the proposals translate into policies and therefore implemented, 5 of those annual targets will be met. So it still identifies that there is a bit of a fingers crossed approach to meeting each of those annual targets, given that the RPP document itself doesn't set out policies and proposals that guarantee that every annual target can be met. And I think if we're serious about tackling climate change, we need to ensure that the implementation plan to deliver that act does include policies and proposals which show how those targets each year are going to be met.
I'm not sure I entirely agree with the cross-fingered approach to meeting targets. However, just on the aspect of transport, I think actually through severe conditions, you will actually find that cars, buses, etc. are actually on the roads for much longer because there's greater delays and various other things. So the emission rate will be much higher. And with regard to the homes and insulation, people, even in very well insulated homes, etc., there's going to be a release of that energy every time someone comes in and out. But I mean, we had an extreme severe winter, and I can take on your point that, you know, we have to try and manage that, because Scotland, as we know, can have very severe climate changes. And I think we're working towards that. And that is the whole issue about trying to ensure that homes are better insulated for the future. But you can't address it overnight.
Yeah, I think we have a debate on winter resilience.
We do.
This afternoon.
This afternoon, in fact.
This afternoon. on the plus side, on the downside, snow is forecast for the weekend. So we're expecting more severe weather.
Thank you, Convener.
Right, Chick Rudy.
Thank you. Good morning. Let me fly a kite. The Scottish Water's budget, resource budget, was cut substantially this year. Capital budget went up. The net impact was minus 24 million. We've talked about the 130 million in Norrie, Mr. Kerr, that we've got to get from the private companies, private utility companies. I'm not terribly optimistic about that, but I just wonder, given in the previous session we talked about European companies looking much more, and governments looking much more closely at European legislation, what would you say to the proposal that Scottish Water create a subsidiary that enters the utilities marketplace, and notwithstanding the state aid claims that issues we've had before, and now taking on board that we're perhaps not looking at European legislation. I mean, what impact do you think that might have in terms of, because they have the database of everybody, they know where everyone is. I mean, in terms of getting them, they have the Horizon project anyway, but do you think it's feasible, desirable, possible to have them create a subsidiary and enter the marketplace to compete with the, I'm not suggesting it's a cartel, but compete with the 6 main energy companies?
I think Ofgem would welcome any further entrant into the energy market, as it has tried to do over the past few years with the cooperative becoming an energy supplier, other people like Ebico or OVO. There are a number of smaller suppliers in the marketplace, and by and large a number of them are out with the regulations which allow them to pay things like the warm home discount or to take part in CERT. So I think we've got to be understanding that when we create yet another entrant, we're looking at the impact, perhaps the unintended consequence, of how they interact with a member of the public. I think that gives further choice, and that choice would be exceptionally useful. However, if you look at, and I'll take the cooperative energy as an example, it's by no means because the cooperative energy supply my house or I'm a member of the cooperative movement. It's just I so happen to have looked at their website.
Supply mine too, I should say.
They have one tariff, which the regulator is trying to do just now. They're trying to reduce overall tariffs, or the number of overall tariffs that are available to consumers. And the co-op pride themselves, and they have one tariff. You go to them, you know what you're going to get. It's easy to compare. You look on their website, the price is there for all to see. But they are not the cheapest. And they say quite categorically they never set out to be the cheapest. They are an alternative to the big six. I think the difficulty in the market, however, is that even the smaller companies need to buy in their energy from the wider global market, which means that the only savings that they can make are on service provision, so billing and metering the supply to your home. And if you look at what element of that makes up your energy bill, it's a very small part of the bill. 46 to 48% of your bill is made up by the wholesale costs of gas and electricity. And that wholesale cost, Ofgem are saying that they want companies to trade more of that commodity on the day-ahead market. Because as it stands just now, the gas or electricity that you use in your house today could have been bought and sold 5 or 6 times before it comes to you. So we've got this part of the market that, quite honestly, I think few people understand, but it is the most significant part of everybody's bill. And I don't think it would matter how many new entrants we created, if we're still working within a marketplace, that's where they've got to go and buy their energy, and that makes up almost half of the bill that they've got to do.
Scottish Water has substantially more clout than some of these other companies, and you know, last year when we were looking at fuel poverty, I went through the accounts of the 6 major utilities over the last 5 years, and you're right, the raw material, the wholesale gas is a large part of the bill, but the increase in you know, indirect or variable costs, particularly in terms of marketing, and we all get. I mean, I don't need a front door carpet now. I just leave the, you know, all of the blower I get from the energy company. So it really is a question of twofold, because it would give, assuming again we achieve the state aid requirements, it also gives us an opportunity to increase revenue to the Scottish budget quite substantially because of the reach that a subsidiary of Scottish Water would have. I mean, I know it's theoretical, but you're the experts and you know what, you know how the market works.
As I said, in terms of a new entrant into the market, that would always be welcome, but they will be playing in a market that all of the other independents play in as well. And what I'm suggesting to you is not all independents are cheaper than the current 6 suppliers that we have. So simply because there's a new entrant into the market may not make them the cheapest option. And if you also look at Ofgem will tell you the amount of sticky customers there are, people who have never ever switched. And that switching, if you move particularly north of Dundee and Perth, is very prevalent, that people have a brand loyalty to the incumbent supplier in that area, because many of them are employed or have a cousin or an uncle or an aunt who's employed. There's a presence on the high street. You can walk into the shop in Pitlochry and ask somebody about your energy bill if you're a member of the incumbent supplier in that particular area. So I think, yes, it's good that there is an opportunity to create a new entrant into the market. I think we just need to be realistic about what that new entrant would be able to do in terms of competition when we're already in a market that, as I've said, is quite difficult for the ordinary person in the street to understand.
That comes back to whether or not we've really got a competitive marketplace. Just one other question. As you know, I'm a great supporter of the Energy Agency in Ayr, at Auchenkrove, and they do a great job. I just wonder, with your experience across Scotland, how much engagement there is with agencies like that and the local authorities. I mean, we talked about culture change today, about the procurement reform bill. So I just wonder, you know, do the local authorities really engage? Do they understand what the objectives are? Do they have capacity to support this? What's your view?
I think the Energy Agency, as you've spoken about, have been in place for a number of years. They have a very good reputation, as do the other organisations who carry out similar work. Many local authorities choose to do that themselves. They have their own energy teams that work very effectively. Dundee is one.
Sorry, that's part of my question. If I look at this and look at the local authority budgets, and you're saying, well, we've got the Energy Agency that does this, but the local authorities have their own energy teams. Is there an overlap? I mean, is there financial capacity within the budget to say, maybe we should outsource it? I don't know. I mean,
I think you've picked the Energy Agency, and what I would say to you is that not all, there are 5 organisations, including the Energy Agency, that cover the whole of Scotland. That's quite difficult when you hit very rural areas. So you're looking at how you can make that service real for the people who are there. It's unlikely that you would get a home visit if you stay in Thurso from an agency that's based in Drumnadrochit. So you're looking at how you can deliver locally. And the example I was going to give was Lochaushan and Skye Housing Association, where what they've said is, as the major housing provider in a particular area, they've undertaken that they will provide an energy team. And that energy team won't just address their own tenants, it will address everyone within the catchment area of where they are. So that's a more appropriate service for them than perhaps a telephone-based advice in Inverness, for example. So I think what we've been encouraging local authorities to do through their local housing strategies is to understand what it is that they can do to support, and in some cases not their tenants, because a number of them are now in terms of stock transfer, but people within the local authority area. That may well be for certain parts of the area to engage with organisations like the Energy Agency or like Changeworks or like SCARF to do that. But it also might mean that in other parts of the area it's important for them to do that because it gives a local delivery on the ground rather than the telephone advice. However, the telephone advice is free across the whole of Scotland. The 0800 number that's backed by the Scottish Government, supported by the Scottish Government, is a vital link, because it means that people will get consistent advice, irrespective from where you are. When you phone that number, you will get someone who's trained to the same standard. They will give you the same advice. So there's a quality mark there, but it will be very generic. It may not be down to the level of what happens in your street, and sometimes that's where a local organisation is able to provide that additional service.
But just briefly, there is duplication in some areas. Is that the case? And we are, for government spending is...
I would not call it duplication, I would call it enhancement.
Thank you.
Okay. The only thing I'd add is that, I mean, adding to what Norrie is suggesting, that there is certainly merit in looking at whether there should be particular targeted programmes of support for rural, remote and island areas to ensure that they can access what's available through the national retrofit programmes, that they can access funding through ECO, and also encourage take-up of the Green Deal, because I think otherwise it's possible that those areas may not receive their fair share, and therefore that housing stock may not be brought up to the standards where in other parts of Scotland there's perhaps more information available, and therefore may see greater uptake.
Thank you.
Right. Mike McKenzie.
Thank you, Convener. Is it not the case that the limiting factor here, the problem is not lack of money, the problem is consumer resistance or apathy, and that when you consider that we've already insulated 60% of the accessible loft spaces and 60% of the cavity walls that are capable of having cavity wall injection, we've got to that, we've picked the low-hanging fruit. It's not lack of money that's the problem, it's consumer resistance. You literally cannot give insulation away. Go into any DIY store, go into any builder's merchant, the literature's there, the free insulation's there, you're falling over it. Talk to any of the big six energy suppliers. They literally can't meet their obligations, not because they're not trying, but they cannot find a way to encourage that remaining 40% to take up the opportunities that are already there for them in terms of increasing the insulation to their homes.
I think when you say the big six can't spend that money, in many respects that's true, but it's in certain groups. It's on their super priority group. So people who are over 70, over 80 on certain benefits. You can find them, but what it takes is a lot of hard work and a lot of expenditure of shoe leather. And that's where we come back to what the local agencies are able to do. For example, the one that Mr Brodie mentioned earlier, the Energy Agency, have an exceptionally good presence on the ground because they receive additional funding from the local authority. And if you look at their impact over the past couple of years, they've pushed more people through that particular programme than any of the other SACs out there. So it's about how you get there locally, it's about the currency that you have on the ground. And quite often, if you see something dropping through your letterbox, as Mr Brodie's suggesting, you simply walk over the top of it. It could be another energy bill. You don't want to read that because that's somebody else chasing you for money. It's about how you make the message local and how you create local champions. And if I can give you an example, there is an organisation based in Lochwinnoch, which you might not necessarily associate with high levels of fuel poverty. But LEAP in Lochwinnoch, the Lochwinnoch Energy Action Project, employ local volunteers, one or two part-time staff, and their job in terms of getting round the locality is to use themselves as trusted intermediaries. So therefore, you're more likely to take up the offer of free insulation or insulation at a reduced price if it's from someone in your local area that you trust, that you believe has a buy-in to your local area as you do, rather than a disembodied voice down a phone at 6 o'clock at night when you're trying to have your tea, who's yet another organisation claiming to represent the Scottish Government and promote Scottish Government grants. So it's all about how we tackle those particular people. And the impact of that is, it's not about bill stuffers, it's a much more costly way of doing it. And again, if you look at the Universal Home Insulation Scheme that Patrick Harvey and colleagues brought forward a number of years ago, that was about being on the ground in a local area, chapping doors. And that programme has been more successful than any of the other programmes that have run to date about increasing the number of people that will take up measures. So that's why Energy Action Scotland, WWF and others are supporting the National Retrofit Programme, because we do believe that it will drive up the uptake in particular areas.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very glad to hear you saying that, but the point I'm making is that throwing money at this problem and throwing it at it quickly, given that those people in Lochwinnoch, for instance, had to be first of all trained up in energy issues before they in turn could then go and give the advice. So in the context of our discussion this morning about the budget, throwing money at the problem may not be the best way to tackle it. So the actual amount of money in any given year or in this year's budget may not be the limiting factor when you consider the this problem in its entirety.
I would be delighted to agree with you if I felt that we were throwing money at the problem. When you think of the costs of the measures that we need to take now being significantly dearer than the measures that we've undertaken in previous years, we're not throwing money at the problem. I know of at least 4 community insulation-based companies who have gone out of business over the last 4 years because they've not had enough work to keep their people employed. And what we are seeing is a reduction in the number of jobs, which means that we've got companies who, quite frankly, are in a position where they're having to lay off staff. So we're not throwing money at the problem, far from it.
Is that not, though, a consequence of this, the low-hanging fruit's been picked? 60% of accessible loft insulation's already been done now.
No. In the old central heating programme, we were insulating 20,000 homes a year. And I'm not talking about gas or electric heating now, I'm talking about loft and cavity wall insulation. We're doing 20,000 homes a year. I think now we're doing somewhere in the region of 3,000 to 4,000 homes a year. Some of that may be because we've done the low-hanging fruit, but many of the organisations that I've spoken about have been in rural areas for a number of years, and they're not getting the work through, they're not getting the budget through. So I'm afraid that at this point, I'm not able to agree that we're throwing money at the problem.
And I think, I mean, just to add to that, certainly cash alone isn't going to fix this problem. We recognise that. But the experience from the Universal Home Insulation Scheme was shown when done at a kind of pilot level just how effective that works in terms of increased level of uptake, the range of measures that can be installed, how the cost effectiveness of doing that in that way, I think is why we have been keen to ensure that that is a key part of the National Retrofit programme for the entirety of Scotland going forward. So our experience from those area-based schemes to date shows that they are very effective and very efficient, get high levels of take-up and deliver strong results. And therefore a national programme that delivers in a similar way is going to require significantly more funding than the level of funding we've seen to date for those more pilot scale of approaches. But the second thing I would say is that for us, of course, there do need to be things that accompany putting cash forward, and that is greater incentives and disincentives. So things like the Green Deal cashback that the government has committed hopefully will help drive up uptake of the Green Deal programme. Looking at council tax rebates, some local authorities already offer that, and again that will help encourage people to install energy efficiency. But we also need to see disincentives, and another key area of work that WS has been looking at is the implementation of minimum standards of energy efficiency for all properties to act as an incentive for people to install energy efficiency and a disincentive to live in an inefficient property. And of course that requires cash as well, because we agree it wouldn't be fair to only require a specific level of energy efficiency of all homes to be brought up to without there being access to cash to enable people to do that. So we think a combination of that regulatory approach with the cash that's available to enable people to then bring their properties up to that standard is the way forward.
And what would you then say to a neighbour of mine, a single mother, living in a 200-year-old cottage that's a listed building, who, if she doesn't comply with that standard of insulation, would be rendered homeless with no other homes in the area? Are you prepared to accept that as a consequence of government imposing minimum standards?
I don't think we're saying that the person couldn't live in the home unless it met a particular standard. I think what we are saying is there are standards that need to be applied if people want to rent out a home. So if your neighbour decided that they wanted to move, downsize, smaller home and rent out that property, is it right that they can rent out that property just now without any form of heating being in the property, without any form of energy saving measures being there at all? I don't think it is. I think we need to be pragmatic about this. If it's a 200-year-old cottage, what can we reasonably do? And that might mean that there is a state-of-the-art heating system that's contained within that cottage that does not detract from the listed building status that undoubtedly it has, but there are things that we can do. Yeah. And if you look at what has been done here in Edinburgh, Changeworks did a lot of work in terms of installing energy efficiency improvements in the heritage site on Georgian houses that you can see from the castle, where they work very closely with Historic Scotland and put in things like secondary glazing that cannot be seen from the street, to dig up concrete floors and replace them with better flooring, to put in solar panels that cannot be seen from the castle or from the street. So there are a number of measures that are available, and I don't think for 1 minute anybody who's pressing for national standards is talking about making people homeless. But what I would say, just to finish, Mr Mackenzie, is if I go in to rent a car today, I expect that car to be roadworthy, to have an MOT, a brake that will stop me, and a seatbelt that will protect me and get me safely to the end of my journey. I have no such assurances when I go and rent privately.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I'm glad you clarified it. My final question is and it's because you touched on the state-of-the-art heating system, and you know, in an ideal world, it seems to me that the UK government initiatives to try and deal with this problem and the Scottish government initiatives would just dovetail very nicely together. That's what you would hope for. But it seems to me that, you know, every time I look with interest at the UK government initiatives, you mentioned the state-of-the-art heating system, the domestic RHI designed, you know, to stimulate that kind of situation, just the situation you describe, still not introduced. We've heard about it for 3-4 years now. The CERT schemes, the CES schemes that don't work in rural Scotland, that certainly don't work in Scotland's islands, where fuel poverty is highest, 50% now in our islands, UK schemes, and the Green Deal that seems to me to be just intrinsically and fundamentally flawed unless energy prices are going to quadruple over the next 2 or 3 years. Perhaps the UK government knows something that we don't know. The problem is the Green Deal is fundamentally flawed and will not work, because when you dig up your concrete floor...
Okay, can we have a question, please, Mr McGinn?
Yep. Well, would you agree with me that digging up that concrete floor, you know, it's just not going to pay for itself under the Green Deal? And do you consider that these UK measures are at all helpful in tackling fuel poverty, and it's therefore a situation where the Scottish Government is left trying to do the job on its own?
If we assume that the UK-led schemes have no impact in reducing fuel poverty in Scotland, then the whole budget that we're discussing today is a sham, because the budget relies on £135 million of those schemes to make it work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that, could you just clarify that? Where does that money, where is it anticipated it will come from?
That money will ultimately come from UK consumers, because the money is not drawn from the energy companies' profits, it's drawn from environmental taxes that are on everybody's energy bill.
But could you just...
hold on. I mean, you know, I'm conscious, Mr McKenzie, you had a very extensive crack at the whip on this line of questioning, and I'm conscious of the time we do have other business to get through, so perhaps you could just let the witnesses answer your question.
Just to come back 2 points, I mean, I think going back to the minimum standards one, I think in time we would argue they need to apply to all properties, but absolutely there should be some, I think we would say, as few as possible exemptions. But of course the key thing is there being financial support to enable that, and we agree that if you look at a number of properties where it isn't possible just to bring those up to a high standard just through relatively cheap options like loft and cavity insulation, you are looking at solid wall insulation. That's exactly why we think there needs to be dedicated government funding available, and we need to ensure that things like the eco-funding works for Scotland and is accessible. I think coming back to Mr McKenzie's questions about the UK framework, now there clearly are some challenges with the UK energy framework, and I think there are some issues about the extent to which Green Deal will genuinely help those in fuel poverty. I think it will help, and I think it will help in cutting emissions from the housing sector. Is it the silver bullet? No, it's definitely not a magic bullet. I think it's going to have a limited role to play in fuel poverty. But I think the Scottish Government has already shown leadership by committing to the National Retrofit Programme, so it has already set itself apart from what the UK Government has done by saying we will have a dedicated programme in Scotland because we agree this is the right thing to do. The challenge for us is, are we getting the right level of support in there, or are we taking enough steps to ensure that those mechanisms that are available at a UK and Scotland level work together to give the most cost-effective and CO2 reducing options available? So can we ensure that the eco money, the Green Deal money, the targeted government funds actually deliver in the best way that gives us the best outcomes? And there is clearly scope to influence that.
Okay, thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Well, I think unless there are... Well, yes, yes.
Just on that, I mean, I was thinking in similar terms to Mike with regard to the spending earlier. Is it the case that were the 135 million and the 65 to work together in a complementary fashion, targeting the right sectors in each way, that would be broadly the kind of financial investment that would be needed to achieve the objectives set out?
I think I would refer you to the point that was made earlier about the ground that we have lost over the past 6 years. If that 200 million had been spent every year for the last 6 years, then broadly I would think we would be on track. But we've not spent anything like that 200 million over the last 6 years. So I would suggest that the 200 million might actually now be 300 million if we're to gain the ground and meet the targets that we have.
And is it the case that in that period the UK wide schemes haven't been resulting in substantial or indeed proportionate investment in Scotland? I remember reading reports that Scotland received perhaps, I think it was 4 or 5% of the overall spending because it was, they were targeting low-hanging fruit at UK level, which is predominantly out with Scotland. Is that the case? Is that a correct understanding?
I think a number of years ago we were around about 6 or 7%, but certainly the Scottish Government have worked very hard to encourage the suppliers to spend proportionately in Scotland over the past 2 or 3 years, and that spend has increased. I think the challenge for us is to ensure that we continue to have that spend, if not at the level it's at just now, but certainly more than that level.
And I think, just to add to that, I mean, the analysis that we've done, which shows that actually we need to see a total investment in the region of 4.6 billion if we're going to meet the 2020 climate targets in our housing sector, and 6.3 billion to meet the fuel poverty targets. Now that is public and private sources, but for us we think as a minimum doubling the amount of funding available to the National Retrofit Programme would be a good start. But we are going to have, and it would be a, I think, really important role for the committee to play on a regular basis, keep in check whether we are seeing the private funding coming forward at a level that's required to ensure that we are confident we can meet those targets, because that is still predicated on receiving substantial private investment to complement the public investments being made.
What does that figure include over and above the National Retrofit Programme? I mean, presumably money invested to bring things up to minimum standards that you were arguing for as well.
The total figure?
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. So bringing all properties up to the minimum standards, ensuring there is sufficient money to support the advice provision, because we think there is, and we've touched on this during the debate, the critical role to play in ensuring that people understand what's available to them, in providing them with tailored support, ensuring that when measures are installed in their properties, they know how to use those measures properly to ensure they get the best benefits. So there's a range of areas where greater investment will be required.
I think just to final add a point to Dan's there, I think it's important for the committee not just to look at the budget, but the impact of the budget. You know, Mr Mackenzie said a couple of times today about the fact that rural areas are not well served. I think what would be helpful for you to investigate is, where was that money being spent? What measures did it result in? Because one of the criticisms of the early days of the UK schemes, the CERT schemes, was that everybody got a dozen low energy light bulbs that no doubt lie in a drawer to this day still. So I think it's about the impact of what we're doing, and are we addressing rural fuel poverty? Are we providing state-of-the-art heating systems? Are we providing solid wall insulation? Are we addressing the particular needs in those areas? That's just as important as how much the budget is. It's are we spending it, and are we spending it effectively?
Right. Thank you very much to our panel. Norman Kerr and Dan Barlow has been very helpful to the committee, having you come along and give evidence. Thank you. Right. In view of the time, I think we'll just move straight on. Item 4 on the agenda is appointment of an EU reporter. As members will be aware, all subject committees are required to appoint an EU reporter to act as a champion for EU matters in the committee. This role was filled by Stuart McMillan, who's moved on to Pastures New, so we have a vacancy. Do we have any nominations for the position?
I nominate Chick Brodie.
Chick Brodie. I'll second that. Okay. Mr Brodie, would you be happy to accept that nomination? Okay. Are there any other nominations? Okay. In that case, Mr Brodie, I'm delighted to confirm your appointment as EU reporter.
Merci beaucoup.
Right. Item 5 on the agenda. We have a very brief draft report on EU engagement 2011-2012, which we're required to provide to the European and External Relations Committee. Anybody got any comments or questions on this draft report? Nope. In that case, do I have members' agreement to approve the draft?
Yep.
very much. Right, just before we move into private session, item 6, I would, as members I'm sure are aware, this is our clerk, Dougie Wan's last meeting of the committee. Dougie's moving on to Pastures New, a secondment to another place for 2 years, is it, Dougie? 18 months to the House of Commons, I think it is, isn't it? Yes. So I'm sure we would like to all extend our good wishes to Dougie on his new venture and thank him for all his efforts on our behalf over the past months. And with that, we'll move into private session.